She came to the ranch to be alone. No neighbors. No noise. No one telling her who she was supposed to be now that he was gone. Just her, the land, and whatever was left of herself after 2 years of grief. But on her third night out there, long past dark, when the only sound should have been whined through dry grass, she heard a truck slow down on the road that had no reason to exist. And then a voice said, "That's her property now. Won't be for long." 3 men, 1 woman, 47 acres of land that somebody wanted badly enough to threaten for. Here's what I want to ask you before we start. If you bought a piece of land fair and square, signed every paper, paid every dollar, and someone showed up at your door and told you that land was theirs now, what would you do? Leave a comment. Tell me your city. Tell me what you'd do. And if you're new here, hit subscribe and leave a like, because this story is going to stay with you. Now let's go back to the beginning. Miriam Callaway had not planned on being a widow at 51. She had not planned on a lot of things. The diagnosis that came on an ordinary Tuesday, the 8 months that followed with their false hopes and exhausted silences, the morning in February when she woke to find Roland's side of the bed cold in a way that was different from all the other cold mornings. She had not planned on surviving him, but she did. And when the worst of the grief had burned down to something lower and more permanent, a dull ember rather than a fire, she found herself standing in their house in Tucson, surrounded by furniture and photographs and the particular smell of a life that had belonged to 2 people and now only belonged to 1. And she thought, I cannot stay here. The ranch had come to her through Roland's estate, a piece of land he had bought years earlier from an old acquaintance, planning vaguely to retire there, to grow something, to slow down. They had driven out to see it twice. 47 acres in the high desert of eastern Arizona, a battered ranch house with a wide porch, a dry creek bed that filled after rain, and mountains in the distance that turned every shade of purple and orange at sunset. Roland had called it the place, like it was already decided, like it had already been theirs for years. After he died, Miriam's sister Paulette urged her to sell it. "What are you going to do out there alone?" Paulette had said over the phone, her voice carrying that particular pitch of worry that Miriam had come to associate with everyone in her life. "It's in the middle of nowhere. You don't know the area. You don't know anyone." "I know," Miriam had said. "That's why I'm going." She packed a truck. She hired a woman named Odeline, a quiet, no-nonsense property manager from the nearest town, a place called Seward's Crossing, to help her with the paperwork and the practicalities. She transferred the deed into her name, paid the property taxes that were 3 months overdue, confirmed the well was still functional and the generator still worked. Then she drove out on a Thursday afternoon in late April, the desert wide and bright around her, and she pulled through the gate and sat in the truck for a long time looking at the ranch house with its weathered wood and its crooked porch railing, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not grief. It wasn't happiness. It was quieter than that. It was possibility. She spent her first 2 days getting the house in order, swept the floors, cleared the dead insects from the window sills, scrubbed the kitchen, aired out the back bedroom where a faint mildew smell had settled into the walls. She found a set of wind chimes left by the previous occupant and hung them on the porch. She found a cracked leather journal in the pantry with nothing written in it, and she set it on the kitchen table. She didn't write anything in it yet, but she liked knowing it was there. Odeline came out on Saturday morning with a list of the neighboring properties and their owners. She sat at Miriam's kitchen table drinking coffee that was too strong and went through the map with a pen, circling names. The Pruitt family, that's the largest spread, about 6 miles northeast. Old family, been here since the 40s. You probably won't see them unless there's a boundary issue. She circled another spot. The Dex operation, that's more of a grazing lease than a real ranch. 3 brothers, not what I'd call friendly, but they keep to themselves. She said that last part in the careful tone of a woman who was leaving something out. Miriam noticed. "Not what you'd call friendly," she repeated. "What would you call them?" Odeline looked at her coffee cup for a moment. "Territorial," she said finally. "The Dex brothers have had their eye on this property for a long time. They ran cattle on it when it was empty. No permission, just did it. When Roland bought it, their father, he passed about 4 years ago, came around and made some noise about it. Nothing legal, just noise. And the brothers? Haven't made any formal move. But you're a single woman, out here alone." Odeline paused. "I just think you should know the landscape." After Odeline left, Miriam stood on the porch and looked out at the land. The dry grass moved in the afternoon wind. The mountains were going gold. She had buried her husband. She had survived 2 years of grief. She had packed a truck and driven herself to the middle of the desert. She was not afraid of noise. But that night, her third night on the property, she heard a truck slow down on the road outside the fence. And she heard, through the open window, a voice say it. That's her property now. Won't be for long. She didn't sleep well after that. Not because she was paralyzed by fear. Miriam had never been that kind of woman, and grief had burned away whatever softness she might have had toward her own comfort. But she lay in the dark with the window open and her ears tracking every sound from the land, and she thought carefully about what she had heard. A truck, 2 voices, maybe 3, but only one she could make out clearly. The slow pace of a vehicle that wasn't passing through, it was observing. She got up at 5:30 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Odeline's map. The Dex property bordered hers to the east. There was a shared fence line that ran for roughly 2 miles before it hit a rocky outcrop and turned. Roland's records, she had a folder of them, showed an ongoing dispute about a water easement, something to do with a seasonal creek that ran across the northeast corner of her land. She hadn't paid much attention to that before. She paid attention to it now. She called Odeline at 8. The easement dispute, she said without preamble. Tell me everything. Odeline sighed. I was wondering when you'd get to that. The story, as Odeline told it, went back further than Roland's ownership. The original ranch, the full parcel, which had once been nearly 200 acres, had been owned by an elderly man named Berthas Colm, who had sold it off in pieces over the years. When he sold the northeast section to Roland's acquaintance, a man named Sewell, he had included a verbal agreement about the Dex family's right to move cattle through the creek corridor twice a year, in spring and fall. Verbal, not written. When Sewell sold the property to Roland, he hadn't mentioned it. When Roland transferred the deed to Miriam, the only outstanding note was a vague reference to historical grazing use that neither of them had thought to investigate. So they believe they have a right to that creek, Miriam said. They believe they have a right to the whole northeast section, Odeline said quietly. Their father used to say the old Colm deal was always meant to include that parcel. That Colm sold it out from under them. I don't know if that's true. I don't think it matters legally. What matters is the brothers believe it. How many brothers? 3. Eldon's the oldest. He's probably 55, 60. Harlan's the middle one. A pause. And then there's Cade. And Cade. Odeline's voice was careful. He's the one who does the talking. Miriam drove into Seward's Crossing that afternoon for supplies. It was a small town, a hardware store, a feed store, a diner, a gas station that doubled as a post office. She stopped at the diner for lunch and sat at the counter and ordered a sandwich and coffee, and within 4 minutes of sitting down she understood that she had already been noticed. The man behind the counter, older, wide-shouldered, with the careful eyes of someone who had lived in a small town his whole life, brought her coffee without being asked and said, You the one took over the Colm parcel? I bought it from Roland Callaway's estate, she said. I'm Miriam Callaway. He nodded once, slowly. I'm Croft. He didn't offer anything else, just went back to the kitchen. She ate her sandwich. The diner was half full, a few ranchers, an older couple, a young woman with a baby. No one spoke to her, but she felt the awareness of the room adjust around her presence the way it does in places where everyone knows everyone. She was almost done when the door opened and 3 men came in. She knew immediately, not because she had met them, because of the way the room changed, a subtle tightening, a redirected attention. The man behind the counter appeared from the kitchen and stood very still. The oldest one was tall and thick, with gray in his beard and a hat he didn't take off. The middle one was stocky, darker, with hands that looked like they'd been broken and reset more than once. The youngest was leaner, maybe 45, with pale eyes and a quality of stillness about him that was more unsettling than the other two's obvious size. He was the one who found her gaze. He held it for a moment. Not hostile exactly, evaluating. Then he said, not to her, to his brothers, but loud enough for the whole room. Spring moving's going to be late this year. Have to see about the corridor. Miriam took a long sip of her coffee and set the cup down and looked at the man behind the counter. Could I get the check? She said. She drove home with her windows down and the radio off. The land was bright and dry around her, the road straight, the the sky enormous overhead. She thought about Roland, who had stood on this land and called it the place and meant it to be something peaceful. She thought about the three men in the diner. She thought about the word corridor. When she got home, she called her nephew Briggs, a paralegal in Phoenix, methodical and thorough. She explained the situation, the easement, the dispute, the verbal agreement that had never been written down. "I need to know exactly what my rights are," she said. "And I need to know what they can legally do and what they can't." "Give me a couple of days," Briggs said. That night she sat on the porch with a glass of water and watched the road. The wind chimes made their small sound. The stars were extraordinary out here, thick and close, the Milky Way visible as a smear of light across the dark. At 9:15, a truck drove slowly past on the county road. It didn't stop, but she saw it pause at the gate, just for a moment, just long enough. She went inside and checked the locks. Then she sat back down at the kitchen table and opened the cracked leather journal to its first page. She wrote one line. "They're going to have to learn who they're dealing with." Briggs called back in 2 days as promised. Miriam was out walking the fence line on the northeast section, the creek corridor, when her phone rang. The dry creek bed ran through a grove of cottonwoods, pale and ghostly, their leaves trembling in a wind she couldn't feel at ground level. It was the most beautiful part of the property, and she was already certain, with the instinct of a woman who had learned to trust her instincts, that this was exactly what they wanted. "Okay," Briggs said, and she could hear him turning pages. "Good news and complicated news. Give me the complicated news first. The verbal easement isn't enforceable. No written record, no legal agreement, nothing filed with the county. You're on solid ground there. And the complicated news? There's a deed discrepancy. Not major, but it exists." He paused. When Bertha's Colm subdivided the original parcel in 1987, he filed the plats himself, by hand. And there's a surveying error on the northeast corner. Maybe 40 feet, maybe 80. It hasn't been adjudicated because no one ever pushed it to court. But if the Dex family wanted to claim that discrepancy created a disputed boundary, they could create a legal problem, a nuisance problem, not a strong claim, but enough to require a survey and potentially months of title dispute. Miriam was standing in the cottonwoods, looking at the creek bed, dry now, but you could see the water line from last season on the stones, a pale mark that said, "Water was here." What would it cost to resolve the surveying discrepancy proactively? A licensed survey, probably $1,000 or $1,200. Then you file the corrected plat with the county. "Do it," she said. "Miriam, you don't have. Schedule the surveyor, Briggs. I want it done before they decide to make noise." She walked back toward the house along the fence, examining the wire as she went. She had grown up in New Mexico, and she knew fence the way she knew weather. You could read a lot of character in how a person maintained their boundary. Her fence was in reasonable shape, 2 or 3 posts that needed resetting, a section of wire that had been cut and retwisted probably years ago. Cut and retwisted. She stopped and looked at it more carefully. It had been cut from the outside and twisted back together from the inside. Old work. The wire had oxidized to the same color as the rest. But it had been done deliberately, and the angle of the cut told her someone had come through rather than a fence simply failing. She photographed it with her phone. That afternoon a truck came up her road. Not to the gate. It stopped at the cattle guard, which was technically outside the fence, technically public access. 2 men got out. The older one and the lean one. Eldon and Cade. She watched them from the porch without moving. Cade lifted a hand in something that was shaped like a greeting, but wasn't quite. She did not lift hers. After a moment, Eldon said something to his brother, and they both walked up to the gate. Cade rested his forearms on the top rail. "Mrs. Callaway," he said. "Mr. Dex." She hadn't confirmed his name. She let him see that she already knew it. Something shifted very slightly in his expression. "We heard you'd settled in. Thought we'd come introduce ourselves proper." "You already introduced yourself," she said. "At the diner." A small pause. "Didn't get a chance to speak to you directly." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The silence between them was the kind that was full of things. Cade looked at the land behind her. Not at the house, at the land, with the particular attention of a man who had been looking at it for years and still considered it a grievance. "We've run cattle through the northeast corridor since before you were born," he said. It wasn't aggressive. It was just flat, the way a fact sounds when it's been repeated so many times it's worn smooth. I understand you have a history with this property, Miriam said. I've reviewed my title and my deed, and I've spoken with an attorney. The corridor you're referring to is part of my titled property with no recorded easement of any kind. If you have a legal claim, I'd be happy to receive it in writing. Eldon's jaw tightened. Cade's expression didn't change. We're not here to make legal claims, Mrs. Callaway. We're here to be neighborly. I appreciate that, she said, and I'm open to neighborly conversations. But I want to be clear about something. She looked at him directly. This is my property. I bought it, I own it, and I intend to stay. If there are specific concerns you'd like to discuss formally, I'm available. But driving past my gate at night is not a conversation I recognize. Cade tilted his head slightly. Something in him recalibrated. She could see it happen. That's fine, he said. That's real fine. They drove away without hurrying. She watched until they were gone. Then she went inside and called Odeline. What do you know about Cade Dex that you haven't told me yet? A long pause. There was a woman about 8 years ago, Odeline said. Bought a small place just west of here. Young woman. Came from Colorado. Within a year, she sold at a significant loss and left. People in town said the Dex boys made things uncomfortable. Uncomfortable how? Fences that came down. Water she had rights to suddenly running different. She found a carcass left inside her fence line once. Livestock, not a threat exactly, but a message, Miriam said. A message, Odeline agreed quietly. Miriam sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the land lay golden in the late afternoon, vast and indifferent. They expect me to leave, she said. Most people do, Odeline said. When they start in. I'm not most people, Miriam said. And I've already lost the thing that would have made me run. She hung up and stood at the window for a long time. Then she picked up the journal and wrote 2 more lines. They made a woman leave once. They think this is the same story. It isn't. The surveyor came on Wednesday. His name was Amos, mid-50s, quiet, the kind of man who communicated primarily through the precise placement of stakes and the careful rolling of maps. He walked the northeast corner with Miriam for 4 hours, shooting grade, marking references, taking photographs. He confirmed what Briggs had suspected, a surveying error of approximately 63 feet along the eastern boundary, consistent with the original 1987 hand-drawn plat. It's been sitting here uncorrected for almost 40 years, Amos said, studying his readings. Whoever bought this property should have caught it in title search. Several people should have caught it, Miriam said. No one did. Well, he looked at the stakes he'd driven. The corrected boundary actually runs about 12 feet further east than the current fence. You've been giving them land. She looked at the fence. The old cut and retwisted section was 20 yards north of where she stood. File the corrected plat as soon as possible, she said. The following morning, she found the wind chimes on the ground. The hook they'd hung from was intact. The chimes had been lifted off deliberately, not blown down. They were arranged on the porch boards in a rough circle, which might have been random and might not have been. She photographed them. She rehung them. 2 days later, her water pressure dropped to almost nothing. She went out to check the well and found that someone had partially closed the valve on the pressure tank. Not enough to cut off water entirely, just enough to make daily life difficult. The valve required a specific tool to turn, and she didn't have that tool in the house. She drove into Seward's Crossing and bought the tool and fixed it herself. She photographed the valve position and the tool marks. She also bought a trail camera at the hardware store and installed it at the gate that evening, angled to capture the road and anything that came up it. She bought a second one and positioned it on the northeast fence line, near the old cut and retwisted section. The third Dex brother appeared on Friday. She hadn't seen Harlan yet. Only Eldon and Kate had come to the gate that first day. Harlan drove up alone, mid-morning, in a different truck. He was the stocky one she remembered from the diner, with the broken and reset hands. He stopped at the cattle guard and called out without approaching the gate. "Ma'am." She was on the porch. "Mr. Dex, just come to return this." He held up a length of fencing wire. "Found it on our side. Wind must have blown it over." There was no reasonable way for wind to carry a section of fence wire across a cattle guard and a county road. They both knew that. "Thank you," she said. He set the wire on the cattle guard post and drove away. She brought the wire inside and photographed it. Then she called a man named Garvey in Phoenix, a name she'd gotten from Briggs, who was a private investigator. "I need a full background on 3 individuals," she said. Property disputes, civil suits, anything in the county records. And I need it quietly. How fast? As fast as is thorough, she said. While she waited, she began introducing herself more deliberately to Seward's Crossing. She ate at the diner twice, each time sitting long enough to let Croft fill her coffee twice. She stopped at the feed store and asked about hay prices and local grazing schedules. She bought gas at the station and chatted with the young woman behind the counter, a red-haired girl named Tassie who had been born in the next county over and knew everyone. People were not exactly warm, but they were watching her. And what they were watching for, she understood, was whether she was the kind of person who would stay. The library in Seward's Crossing, a small room attached to the town hall, had county records going back to 1940. She went on a Thursday afternoon and spent 3 hours there, working through the deed history of the original Colm parcel and the adjacent Dex property. She found something. In 1971, before the parcel had been subdivided at all, the original Dex patriarch, Eldon and Cade's grandfather, had filed a claim against Bertha's Colm's father for unlawful enclosure of common grazing land. The claim had been dismissed. 16 years later, when Colm subdivided and sold pieces, the Dex family had filed an objection with the county, also dismissed. The pattern was clear. The Dex family had never legally owned the Northeast Corridor. They had only ever wanted to. And every time it was settled against them, they waited and tried again. She made copies of everything. She mailed them to Briggs. That evening, Garvey called back. "Your 3 individuals have an interesting history," he said. "The oldest, Eldon, has 2 civil suits in county court, both property disputes, both settled quietly. The middle one, Harlan, has a misdemeanor trespass charge from 2009 that was reduced and expunged. And Cade," a pause. "Cade is more careful. No record. But there's a restraining order filed by a woman in 2016. It was filed, then withdrawn 3 weeks later. Do you know why it was withdrawn? I don't. But the woman sold her property 6 months after that and moved out of state." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Is there a pattern there?" she said. "With property? Every dispute they've had, every single one, involves land adjacent to theirs. They don't go looking for trouble. The trouble always seems to start when someone new moves in near them. And the new owners always leave." "Every one," Garvey said. Miriam sat at the kitchen table after she hung up. The evening light was coming through the window in long slants, gold and dust. The journal was open in front of her. She thought about Roland, about the 2 times they'd driven out here and stood on the porch and watched the mountains go purple at sunset, about the way he'd said the place like it was already decided. She wrote in the journal, "It was always going to be this land, and I was always going to be the one who stayed." Garvey's information changed the texture of her caution. It wasn't fear. She examined it carefully to make sure it wasn't fear, because there is a difference between appropriate alertness and fear, and she had no use for the second kind. It was more like what happens when the fog clears and you can finally see the actual shape of the terrain you're moving through. The Dex brothers were not impulsive. They were patient and methodical, and they operated in a specific way, not direct confrontation, but slow accumulation of pressure until the target simply stopped resisting. She needed to change the terrain. She called the county sheriff's office and spoke with a deputy named Rennick, a younger man, cautious in the way of someone navigating local relationships carefully. She reported the valve incident, the wind chimes, the fence wire, and the truck she had heard her first night. She was precise. She used dates and times. She mentioned the trail cameras. Rennick said he would make note of it and drive past her gate on his rounds. It wasn't much, but it was a thread in the record. The corrected plat came back from Amos on a Thursday, official, stamped, filed with the county recorder. Her boundary was now legally established at its corrected position. Briggs confirmed it was in the system. She sent a certified letter to each of the 3 Dex brothers, not threatening, not aggressive, simply factual. It stated that the corrected survey had been filed, that the northeast boundary was now a matter of county record, that no easement or right-of-way existed across her property, and that any encroachment would be treated as trespass. She kept copies. She sent copies to Briggs. She also called a woman named Wexler, a local rancher who had been pointed out to her by Tassie at the gas station as someone who had been at odds with the Dex family herself years earlier. Wexler was in her 70s, sharp as wire, and she listened to Miriam's account with the attentive silence of a person who has heard this story before. The Dex boys are used to people disappearing, Wexler said. It's all they know how to do to a problem. Wear it down. I'm not wearing, Miriam said. I can see that. A pause. You want some advice from an old woman who's been here longer than they have? Yes. Don't wait for them to escalate to something large. Every little thing they do, document it. Make the record. Because when it does escalate, you want the judge to see a pattern, not an incident. Miriam was already doing most of this, but the word escalate sat with her. It came on a Saturday night. She had gone to bed at 10, which was her habit now, early to bed and early to rise in the old rancher's rhythm that the land seemed to demand. She had left both trail cameras running. She slept lightly, the way she had since her first night on the property. At midnight, she woke to a sound she recognized and didn't recognize, a distant crackling, not electrical, something organic and fast. She was out of bed and at the window before she had fully thought it through. The northeast pasture, the dry grass along the fence line. Fire. Not a large fire. Not yet, but moving, orange and low along the ground, spreading in the wind toward the cottonwood grove and the creek corridor. She pulled on boots and grabbed her phone and ran. She called 911 while she moved, her voice steady and clear. Fire, rural property, northeast pasture, Callaway Ranch, County Road 14. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. She kept running. She had a water tank on a trailer, a small one, 200 gallons, that she'd bought for exactly the kind of dry summer emergency the land demanded. The tractor was in the small outbuilding, and she had practiced the hookup twice because she was that kind of woman. She had the trailer coupled and the tractor running in 4 minutes, which was not fast enough and was faster than most people could have managed. The fire was in the grass, not the trees yet. The cottonwoods were still standing in their pale, ghostly line, visible against the orange glow. She drove the tractor hard along the interior fence track, came at the fire from the west where it was thinnest, and started running water along the line. Back and forth. The tank was 200 gallons and it lasted 12 minutes, and she used every drop with precision, wetting the grass ahead of the fire's eastern edge and letting the wind work against it. When the fire department arrived, 20 minutes after her call, which was good time for a rural volunteer company, the fire was contained. Not extinguished, but contained. She had held the line. The lead firefighter, a woman named Grady with ash on her cheekbones and a calm professional manner, looked at the burn pattern and then at Miriam and said, very carefully, "This fire started at the fence line." "Yes," Miriam said. "It did. Not inside. At the line." "I know," Miriam said. She walked Grady to the trail camera on the northeast fence. They pulled the car together. The image was grainy in the dark, but it was clear enough. A figure on the outside of the fence line. A flicker. The beginning of the fire. Grady looked at the image for a long time. Then she looked at Miriam. "You'll want to call the sheriff," she said. "Not a deputy. The sheriff." "Yes," Miriam said. "I will." She stood in the field after the trucks left, the smell of smoke thick around her, the cottonwoods still standing, the creek corridor intact. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. The mountains were a dark line against something less dark. She had won this round. And she understood now, with a clarity that came from standing in a burned field at 4 in the morning, that they had made a serious mistake. They had been careful for years, careful enough to avoid any provable act. In their patience and their certainty that she would leave, they had miscalculated. She had not left. And now there was a camera card with a face on it. She called the sheriff at sunrise. His name was Aldous Pruitt, the same Pruitt family Odeline had mentioned her first Saturday, the old family 6 miles northeast. He was in his late 50s, deliberate in his movements and his speech, with a face that had been weathered by the same sun and wind as everything else out here. He arrived at her property at 7:30 in the morning with a deputy and a crime scene technician from the county seat. Miriam gave him everything. The trail camera card, the photographs she had taken over the past 3 weeks, the valve, the wind chimes, the fence wire, the vehicle on the road her first night, the certified letters she'd sent and their receipts, Garvey's findings, the civil suits, the 2016 restraining order, the county records from the library, Amos's survey filing, a complete, organized record in a manila folder she had assembled specifically for this moment. Pruitt went through it carefully, standing at her kitchen table, taking his time. "You've been building this file," he said. "Yes." "Since when?" Since before I arrived, she said. Odeline told me enough to know I should be prepared. He nodded slowly. He studied the camera image for a long time. The figure was male, the build consistent with any of the three brothers. The flicker of ignition was visible. It wasn't a perfect image. A good defense attorney would call it ambiguous. But it was real, and it was there. This is arson, he said. Yes. On a rural property, with dry grass, in May. This could have taken the cottonwoods, the outbuildings. Could have spread to the house. Yes, she said. It could have. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her directly. Mrs. Callaway. The Dex family and the Pruitt family have been neighbors for 60 years. I want to be honest with you about that. I appreciate it, she said. I also want to be honest that what I'm looking at in this file is a pattern of harassment and intimidation targeting a property owner, culminating in what appears to be deliberate arson. That's a felony. He closed the folder. The 60 years doesn't change what I'm looking at. No, she said. It doesn't. He sent his deputy and technician to the burn site. He made a phone call she couldn't hear from the kitchen. Then he came back and drank the coffee she'd offered and said, I'm going to bring them in for questioning today. All three. She nodded. This is going to make you unpopular, he said. Some people in this county have a long memory about the Dex family. I was unpopular the day I arrived, Miriam said. I don't need to be popular. I need to be here. He almost smiled. Then he left. She sat on the porch and waited. The questioning happened that afternoon at the county sheriff's office in the nearest town. She wasn't there. Briggs drove out to be with her instead, and they sat at the kitchen table and went over the full legal picture, and Briggs told her what he had confirmed. Between the arson evidence, the documented harassment, and the boundary disputes, there was enough for a civil claim against the Dex brothers even if the criminal investigation didn't result in charges. The corrected survey alone establishes trespass going back potentially years, Briggs said. The cut fence wire, the unauthorized valve access, the fire, it builds. What are my options? You could file a civil harassment suit. You could push for a restraining order, a real one, not a withdrawn one, keeping them off your boundary. If the arson charge sticks, the criminal case runs parallel and strengthens the civil position. Do it, she said. All of it. Pruitt called her at 6 that evening. We brought in Harlan and Eldon, he said. Cade's attorney had him there before we asked. Of course. Harlan Dex has a burn on his right forearm. Fresh. He says he burned it on a tractor engine this morning. His brother confirms it. A pause. The camera image shows the figure using their right hand at the point of ignition. Miriam closed her eyes briefly. Is that enough? It's not a match. But combined with everything else, it establishes probable cause for a warrant. We're requesting it this evening. She hung up and told Briggs. He was quiet for a moment, then said, They made a mistake. They made several, she said. But the first one was deciding I was the kind of woman who would leave. The warrant came through on Monday. The search of the Dex property found accelerant, a metal container with residue consistent with the burn pattern on her fence line, in an outbuilding on Eldon's portion of the spread. They also found a printed copy of her corrected survey, annotated in the margins with measurements and notes. They had been studying her boundary. The district attorney's office filed arson charges against Harlan Dex on Wednesday. Eldon was charged as an accessory. Cade, careful, lawyered-up Cade, was named in the civil harassment suit that Briggs filed the same week. His attorney responded within 48 hours, which told Miriam that he had been watching this moment approach and had been preparing for it. It didn't matter. The record was built. The pattern was documented. The land was surveyed and filed and legally established in her name with no ambiguity and no outstanding claims. On Friday morning, she drove into Seward's Crossing. She stopped at the diner. Croft brought her coffee without being asked and then, after a moment, brought a slice of pie she hadn't ordered. On the house, he said, and went back to the kitchen. Tossie at the gas station waved at her from across the parking lot. An older man she'd seen at the feed store nodded once from his truck. It wasn't warmth. Not exactly. But it was something. It was the particular shift in a small community when they decide that a newcomer has earned the right to stay. She drove home on the county road with the windows down and the desert bright around her. At the gate, she stopped and got out and looked at her land, at the dry grass and the distant mountains and the pale line of cottonwoods in the northeast corner where the creek corridor ran. All of it hers. She opened the gate and drove through and closed it behind her. The trial for Harlan Dex took place 4 months later. Miriam attended the first day, sitting in the county courthouse in a town 40 miles away, watching Harlan's attorney argue that the burn on his arm was a coincidence and the camera image was inconclusive. She watched the DA present the accelerant evidence, the pattern of harassment, Garvey's documentation of prior incidents, the withdrawn restraining order from 2016, and the testimony of 2 former property owners who had sold after the Dex brothers began pressuring them, both of whom had been located by Garvey and agreed to speak. She watched the jury. She could not read juries. No one truly can. But she watched them watching, and what she saw was people paying attention. People from this same desert, some of them ranchers themselves, listening to a pattern they recognized. Harlan was convicted of arson. Eldon entered a plea on the accessory charge. Cade's civil case was settled out of court the week before the criminal trial concluded. His attorney, reading the momentum, negotiated a settlement that included a formal written acknowledgement that no easement or right-of-way of any kind existed across Miriam's property, and a payment of damages that Miriam put directly into a fund for fence repair and a new water storage tank. She did not celebrate any of this. It didn't feel like celebration. It felt like the ground finally being level beneath her feet. She called Odeline after the verdict. "Well," Odeline said, and in that single word there was a great deal. "Yes," Miriam agreed. "I want you to know," Odeline said, "that I've been in this county for 31 years, and I have never seen anyone go up against those 3 and come out with documentation like you had. Most people panic. Most people react. You just documented. I've spent 2 years dealing with things I couldn't control," Miriam said quietly. "I learned to focus on what I could." A long pause on the line. "I'm sorry about your husband." "Thank you," Miriam said. She walked out to the northeast corner that evening. The cottonwoods were going gold. It was October now, and even in the desert the light was different, lower and more amber. The creek bed was dry still, but the stones held their water line from last season's rain. That pale mark saying, "Water was here. Water will come again." She had planted a line of native shrubs along the southeast boundary, a small thing, but hers. She had repaired the well housing and replaced the pressure tank. She had begun clearing a second garden bed near the porch. She was building something. Not yet sure what, but building. Briggs had asked her, in the weeks after the trial, whether she would stay, whether all of this had changed things for her. She had thought about it honestly before answering. "This is where Roland would have wanted to be," she said finally. "And it's where I want to be now." It stopped being his wish and became mine somewhere along the way. I'm not sure when. "Somewhere around the fire," Briggs had suggested, half joking. "Maybe," she had said. "Or maybe the morning I heard that truck on the road and didn't go back to bed." She stood in the cottonwoods in the amber October light and felt the wind move through the leaves. The chimes on the porch were audible from here on a still day, a faint and faraway sound. The mountains to the east had gone into their evening colors, the deep purple she had noticed the very first time Roland drove her out here, years before anything had been decided, before the land was theirs or the grief was hers. She had thought then that the mountains looked permanent, that they would outlast everything. She thought the same thing now, but she also thought, and here I am. The cracked leather journal filled up slowly, the way things do when they are built honestly rather than performed. By spring, her second spring at the ranch, it held more than she had expected. Not a diary, exactly. More like evidence. The surveying notes from Amos, copies of letters, a pressed cottonwood leaf, a photograph she'd taken of the creek when it ran for the first time after a 3-day rain in November, the water moving silver over the stones, the water line she had memorized finally being matched by the real thing. She had written Roland's name in it once. Near the back, in a page she hadn't planned on writing. Just his name, and below it, "You were right about the place." She hadn't expected to leave it at that, but she had. It was enough. Wexler came out in March, driving a battered truck with a dog in the back and a bottle of scotch on the seat, and they sat on the porch and drank and watched the evening and talked about nothing of consequence for a long time. Then Wexler said, "I've been out here 40 years and I've seen a lot of people come and go. This county chews people up." "I noticed," Miriam said. "What made you different?" "Not in a boasting way. I'm asking sincerely." Miriam thought about it. "I had already lost the worst thing," she said finally. "When you've already lost the worst thing, smaller losses don't have the same leverage. They tried to take the land, and I thought, What are they going to do after that? Because I've already been through the worst of it. I'm still standing. Wexler was quiet for a moment. That's not something most people know about themselves. I didn't know it either, Miriam said. Until I did. In April, a woman drove out to the ranch from Seward's Crossing. Young, maybe 30, recently divorced, looking at a small property 2 miles down the road with clear uncertainty in her eyes. Tassie at the gas station had given her Miriam's name, had said there was a woman out there who had settled in and knew the area. The woman's name was Selah. She sat in Miriam's kitchen and drank coffee and looked at her hands and asked, "Is it hard, being out here alone?" Miriam considered the question carefully. "It's hard in some ways," she said. "The work is real. The distance is real. And there are people who will test you, who will look at a woman alone on a piece of land and decide that means something about what they can do." "That's what I'm afraid of," Selah said quietly. "I know." Miriam poured her more coffee. "But here's what I learned. The land doesn't care what you've been through. It doesn't care that you're a woman or that you're alone or that you're starting over. It just asks whether you're going to stay." Selah looked out the kitchen window at the land. "And if you stay, then you're a rancher," Miriam said simply. Selah bought the property. Miriam helped her with the paperwork, connected her with Odeline, walked the fence line with her the first afternoon, and pointed out what to look for. She did not tell her that everything would be easy. She told her the truth, that it would ask more than she expected and give more than she expected, and that the asking and the giving were part of the same thing. In May, 1 year after she'd first pulled through the gate in the late afternoon light, Miriam sat on the porch at sunset and opened the journal to a clean page. The cottonwoods in the northeast corner were bright green. The creek had run 3 times since November. The repaired fence line was holding. The mountains were doing what they always did, going through their evening colors, purple to orange to dark. She wrote, "1 year. The place is still the place. I am still here." She closed the journal. The wind chimes moved in the evening breeze. Above the mountains, the first star appeared, tentative and bright, the way it always is at the beginning of the dark. She watched it for a long time. Then she went inside. Miriam Callaway came to the ranch because she had run out of ways to stay in the life she'd had. She came to be alone, which is one of the bravest things a person can do when aloneness feels like loss rather than choice. And she stayed, not because everything got easier, not because the land stopped asking things from her, but because staying became the truest expression of who she was. The grief and the land and the fight had done something she hadn't expected. They had introduced her to herself, to the version of herself that documented rather than panicked, that planted shrubs while sending certified letters, that held a fire line at midnight with 200 gallons of water and then called the sheriff at sunrise. 3 men told her, in their way, that she didn't belong there, that the land would outlast her resolve, that women alone in desert places eventually fold. They were wrong about all of it. The place Roland had called the place turned out to be hers in a way that had nothing to do with deeds or surveys or county records, though those mattered, and she kept them in a folder and knew exactly where they were. It was hers in the way that land becomes yours when you have stood your ground on it in the dark, when you have watched the water finally run in a dry creek bed, when you have pressed a leaf from a cottonwood tree into the pages of a journal and written a dead man's name beside it. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Tell me your city. Tell me what you would have done. If you're watching this and you've ever had to hold a line when everything in you wanted to let go, this one was for you. Like this video, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next story.